Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
January 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy is sworn in as president after winning one of the closest elections in U.S. history. America is divided and the economy is recovering from a deep recession. But Kennedy's campaign promise to get the country moving again inspires the nation with renewed optimism. However, beneath the surface lies a growing fear of the perceived threat from the USSR. A fear fueled by deteriorating relations between East and West, as both nations race to develop increasing numbers of nuclear weapons and tip the balance of power in their favor.
Enemy aircraft are over Canada and headed this way. Normal broadcasting has been discontinued at the moment.
While the people of the Soviet Union may share these fears, they too ride a wave of optimism, led by their dominance in the space race. They are the first to put a satellite into orbit with Sputnik 1 in 1957, and 4 years later, they are the first to put a man in space. But behind the scenes, Premier Nikita Khrushchev and his communist government grow increasingly unsettled as the U.S. expands their nuclear forces across Western Europe, placing ballistic missiles in Britain, Italy, and Turkey. It's a provocative move by the U.S. on the global chessboard, as Turkey sits alarmingly close to the Soviet Union and well within striking distance of Moscow itself. But the Soviet Union actively seeks to extend its own sphere of influence by aiding the spread of communism throughout Latin America. In January 1959, after nearly 6 years of guerrilla war, Castro seizes control of Cuba from the corrupt Batista regime. At first, there is a hope for a new beginning between the two nations. Once in power, Castro selects non-communists for key positions in his new government. But soon, at the urging of Che Guevara and Castro's brother Raúl, the country leans further towards communism. Later that year, Castro's visit to America is generally friendly. The U.S. government remains cautiously optimistic that the differences with the new regime can be worked out. But these hopes would prove unfounded. In August 1960, Castro formally nationalizes all foreign-owned property and businesses in Cuba, including many American holdings.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached. Our sympathy goes out to the people of Cuba, now suffering under the yoke of a dictator.
In protest, the U.S. recalls its ambassador from Havana, freezes all Cuban assets on American soil, and tightens an already strict trade embargo. As a result, 95% of Cuba's sugar production is suddenly without a buyer. Desperately in need of a new trading partner, Castro turns to the USSR and establishes ties that would turn the Caribbean nation into a staunch Soviet ally, just 90 miles from American shores. President Kennedy, just months into his first term, inherits a classified plan from the Eisenhower administration to remove Castro from power. The plan involves training and supporting an invasion force of Cuban exiles to seize control of the island nation. Kennedy decides to continue with the strategy set forth by his predecessor. However, he demands changes so that the U.S. can retain plausible deniability for the attack. The plans are updated to reduce airstrikes, remove any direct involvement by the U.S. military, and relocate the invasion site to an isolated bay 80 miles west called Bahía de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. The attack is a catastrophe. Poor intelligence, bad planning, and a lack of commitment by the U.S. allows Castro's military to defeat the invading force within 3 days, leaving hundreds dead and the survivors to be captured. The botched operation is a major embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. Not only is the U.S. involvement blatantly obvious to the rest of the world, but the attack pushes Castro closer to the Soviets as Khrushchev steps in and vows to protect Cuba from U.S. aggression. September 1961. Tensions between Washington and Moscow reach an all-time high with the construction of the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Union resumes testing its nuclear weapons, ending a 2-year moratorium. The U.S. responds in kind.
This government will not hesitate.
Then, despite President Kennedy's public warning against the introduction of offensive weapons to Cuba, Khrushchev sets in motion highly secretive plans to install strategic nuclear weapons onto Cuban soil. The stage is set for arguably the most dangerous confrontation between two rival nations in human history. Soviet planning and preparation is executed in absolute secrecy. Elaborate cover stories are created for everyone involved. Technicians work to build 9 sites under the guise of machine operators and irrigation and agricultural specialists. Khrushchev is assured that the missiles can be effectively concealed from U.S. intelligence. The U.S. begins receiving disturbing reports filtering in from Cuba, and the decision is made to investigate. America's U-2 spy plane, a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, is deployed to gather intelligence. October 16th, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy presents Kennedy with definitive photographic evidence of Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. This marks the beginning of the crisis for the president and prompts him to form the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as ExComm, a group of key advisors that includes his brother, Robert Kennedy, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, CIA Director John McCone, and General Maxwell Taylor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The group convenes immediately to assess the situation. Their meetings are secretly taped by Kennedy, using a hidden recorder known only to the president and his brother. On the 18th, the president has a previously scheduled meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Kennedy attends, but doesn't let on that he's aware of the missiles in Cuba. As the president campaigns for midterm elections, the CIA confirms the location of 3 medium-range ballistic missile sites. ExComm quickly meets to analyze the escalating situation. The initial discussions center around a decisive military response. To keep the public and the Soviets unaware that anything is amiss, Kennedy fakes a cold and returns to Washington. Back in Washington, the ExComm meetings are highly charged. Advisors are deeply at odds on the best response to the crisis. Many in the group insist on airstrikes, or even an invasion of Cuba. After much deliberation, ExComm settles on a naval blockade as an initial response to the crisis. It's considered a strong but limited use of force, leaving the U.S. with more flexibility to react to changing conditions. Kennedy prepares to address the nation, but first writes a letter to Khrushchev, reinforcing the U.S. position and cautioning the USSR to tread carefully.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week,
during the televised speech, U.S. military forces are placed on heightened alert, from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3, one step closer to war.
To halt this offensive buildup, A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities.
I'd hate like heck to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stopped Russia from having things our own way.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.
October 23rd. Seeking support from South American allies, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk addresses the Organization of American States, which quickly adopts a resolution calling for the immediate dismantling of the ballistic missiles. At 7:06 p.m., President Kennedy signs Proclamation 3504 to officially blockade Cuba. Naval forces begin moving into position, with orders to board and search any ship suspected of carrying offensive weapons. New low-altitude photo reconnaissance provides detailed evidence of additional SAM and ballistic missile sites. At 9:30 p.m., U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy visits Ambassador Dobrynin at the Soviet embassy. The ambassador maintains that the offensive missiles do not exist in Cuba. Meanwhile, the president orders the blockade ring to be contracted from 800 to 500 miles, to give the Soviets more time to turn back their ships and to prevent a violent confrontation at sea that could lead to war. More ominously, the Strategic Air Command, responsible for the U.S.'s strategic bombers and ballistic missiles, is placed on DEFCON 2. This alert level is just one step away from all-out nuclear war. It is the only time in history that this has occurred. As U.S. ships take their new positions, Soviet submarines patrol the waters of the Caribbean to protect their vessels. The U.S. Navy is unaware that they are equipped with nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and if attacked, could push the crisis to the point of no return. Khrushchev condemns the blockade in a telegram to President Kennedy, adding that Soviet ships will be ordered to ignore it.
Mr. President, if you coolly weigh the situation which has developed, not giving way to passions, you will understand that Soviet Union cannot fail to reject the arbitrary demands of the United States.
Crowds of protesters converge on U.S. embassies around the world as public opinion turns against the United States. The blockade is seen to be aggravating the situation, pushing the world one step closer to nuclear war. October 25th. In a significant turn of events, and contrary to Khrushchev's previous statement, the Soviet Union turns back 14 ships. While the blockade is successful in preventing new weapons from reaching Cuba, it does nothing to address the weapons already in place, weapons that are about to become fully operational. Soviet technicians work around the clock to prepare R-12 medium-range missiles for launch. Unbeknownst to U.S. intelligence analysts, these missiles have a greater range than initially thought, with the ability to reach not just Washington, but New York City in less than 15 minutes. To swing international support to their side, the the U.S. presents photographic evidence to the UN Security Council and challenges the Soviet delegate to explain.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Stevenson, would you continue your statement, please? You will receive the answer in the due course. Do not worry.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
After the contentious UN meeting, the crisis continues to escalate as Khrushchev orders Soviet armed forces into an advanced state of readiness. October 26. In a letter, Castro urges Khrushchev for an immediate nuclear strike in the event of a U.S. invasion of Cuba.
If they manage to carry out an invasion of Cuba, then that would be the moment to eliminate this danger forever, in an act of the most legitimate self-defense. However harsh and terrible the solution, there would be no other.
Despite Castro's demands, Khrushchev sends President Kennedy a message with a more conciliatory tone.
Mr. President, you and I should not now pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war. If there is no intention to tighten that knot and thereby to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this.
Khrushchev offers to remove the missiles from Cuba in return for a U.S. guarantee that Cuba will not be invaded. Kennedy is reluctant to issue an immediate response to the letter, cautious of traps hidden within its wording. Intelligence teams analyze the message overnight to prepare for a response in the morning. U.S. strategic bombers, armed with nuclear weapons, remain airborne 24 hours a day. The United States is poised to attack at a moment's notice. Midnight Friday, the eve of what presidential advisor Theodore Sorensen would call the worst day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, also known as Black Saturday. Premier Khrushchev delivers a radio address with an offer to the U.S. that conflicts with the previous one. There is an additional demand: the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. For the president and his advisors, the new proposal adds an additional layer of complexity to the situation, not the least of which is the public airing of the offer, which makes it more difficult for the U.S. to refuse such a seemingly reasonable deal. It also raises questions about who is actually in control at the Kremlin. Recordings from the XCOM sessions reveal disagreement between the president and every single one of his advisors on how to address the different Soviet messages. XCOM members insist that the president disregard the second offer and refuse to make any concessions. Kennedy tries to find a way to respond to both offers with a calculated blend of compromise and deflection that seeks to resolve the immediate situation in Cuba before attending to the additional Soviet demands. Suddenly, a new incident threatens to derail diplomatic efforts. A U-2 is shot down over Cuba, killing Major Rudolf Anderson. The chances of a Cuban anti-aircraft gun destroying the plane are next to zero. It is almost certain that the Soviet SAMs knocked down the aircraft. U.S. military leaders urged the president to immediately retaliate with airstrikes. But Kennedy suspects the missile launch was against direct orders from Khrushchev. Adding to the tension, the Soviets conduct a nuclear test, while the U.S. conducts tests of its own. Both sides seem to be demonstrating their willingness to use these terrifying weapons to resolve their differences once and for all. New reports arrive at the White House that additional U.S. aircraft have been fired upon while on reconnaissance flights. Kennedy again refuses to retaliate. Military leaders call for massive airstrikes against Cuba by Monday morning unless irrefutable evidence surfaces that the weapons have been dismantled. Meanwhile, 3 Navy destroyers chase a Soviet submarine, dropping practice depth charges in an attempt to force it to surface. They are unaware that the submarine carries nuclear torpedoes. The incident nearly erupts into a deadly skirmish that could bring the nations one step closer to all-out war. At 7:45 p.m., a decision is reached at the White House. Robert Kennedy personally delivers a letter to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin at 8:05 p.m. The president is willing to end the blockade and issue guarantees that the U.S. will not invade if the Soviet government dismantles its missile bases in Cuba. In return, Kennedy agrees to remove the missiles from Turkey within 6 months, but without public admission. This is a crucial aspect of the offer for the U.S. Robert Kennedy requests a Soviet response by Sunday. The meeting lasts no more than 15 minutes. The pressure on Khrushchev to reach a decision mounts. The U.S. deadline quickly approaches, and the Strategic Air Command is poised to launch a nuclear strike. The fate of the world as we know it hangs in the balance. Finally, the Soviets make their decision. With messages taking hours to send between Moscow and Washington, Khrushchev's response is publicly transmitted in a radio address to save time.
The Soviet government, in addition to previously issued instructions on the cessation of further work at the building sites for the weapons, has issued a new order on the dismantling of the weapons which you describe as offensive and their return to the Soviet Union.
The following is the text of President Kennedy's statement of noon. I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them to the Soviet Union under UN verification. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace.
Because of the key stipulation that the removal of the U.S. missiles from Turkey be kept secret, the Soviets appear to have backed down in the public eye. This aspect of the agreement would remain undisclosed for a quarter of a century. The president requests U.S. television networks downplay this apparent victory for the United States. Kennedy and the world can finally breathe easy. Nuclear war has been averted. The crisis has been diffused. But the slightest change in circumstances could have led to a very different outcome.
I know I agreed to do this, but it's a lot heavier than I thought it would be.
Welcome to Cuba. I remember this place very well. A lot of memories here. I was straight out of boot camp down to Corpus Christi. We got activated and did a lot of training, and it took about a month's training on landing, shore landing, and crammed it down into about a week. So we knew something was coming.
I worked at Kirtland Air Force Base in the Special Weapons Unit. My specialty was guidance systems for ICBMs.
Well, we're actually right in front of my house when I was a boy. and this is my neighborhood. All through this area was the neighborhood that I grew up in. Yeah, this was a great neighborhood. You know, it wasn't fancy, you know, working class, but everybody kept their houses in order.
Мы базировались на Кубе, на западной стороне острова, на аэродроме номер 9.
There was a lot of us here, probably 20,000 of us. Our objective was to take over the missile facilities, destroy them. We knew there were going to be Russians here, Russian soldiers, and we knew we were going to get in a pretty good firefight, but we figured with as many troops as we had, it would be a piece of cake. We figured it'd be an overrun, we'd be in and out of here in a day or two. Was that a surprise? Then all I remember is big flash. And then the wind and the sand and the air and everything, it pushed you back, picked you up, threw you down, pushed you back forward. I was unconscious 5-6 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, I don't know.
Well, I remember hearing about the attack on the soldiers who were making the amphibious landing in Cuba. And it was a tactical nuclear weapon that was used.
God, it was awful. People were burned, their faces burned, their eyes were burned out, the lips are burned off. The smell, burning flesh, the air, the water. You could smell the jungle that was all burned up. It was terrible. I remember saying to myself, I don't want to die here.
The schools were out, everybody was home, everybody was watching television or listening to the radio, trying to figure out what was going to happen next. My dad had just gotten back from going out looking for groceries, and he hadn't been able to find any in any of the stores in the neighborhood. They were all cleaned out. My friend Todd's family was going over to Mandeville to see if they could find food, and he came to me. And I remember he pulled my hand out, and he stuck about $30 in cash in my hand, and he closed my hand up, and he said, go with them and get some food, get what you can.
И американцы бомбили Кубу в то время. И нам был отдан приказ подниматься в небо и лететь в сторону Техаса.
I was in the bunker before New Orleans was hit. We knew there were Russian bombers in the air. We didn't really know what they were going to do, if or when they were going to strike. And it was kind of surreal. It was like everybody was like an inch away from panic, and at the same time, everybody was so focused.
Американские зенитные батареи сбивали самолеты с нашей эскадрильи. И мы решили, что до Техаса мы не дотянем. У меня не было другого выбора. Я должен был сбросить этот весь военный комплект.
We went across the causeway, and we were in the store there when it happened.
Я выпустил этот военный комплект прямо на Новый Орлеанс.
Todd was in front of me, and he was just about out the door, and I was about 5 or 6 feet behind him. And there was this flash.
Я знал, что что-то страшное случилось под нами, то, что я видел большой взрыв. Это, наверное, атомная бомба. Я очень переживал насчет этого.
Somehow we talked Todd's dad into coming to try to come back. Everybody we knew was gone.
I was in the bunker with the president. And we'd been there for some time. There had been a great deal of speculation. News was scarce. But when the news came in, Boy, I'll never forget the look on his face. It was like everything boiled down to that one man, that one moment, and I gotta tell you, that was the hardest decision I think that was ever made by anybody. But there was nothing else we could do. So, you know, the football, you know, the briefcase that all codes are all written in, and that guy was there, codes were put in, we retaliated.
This is what you get when you set off a nuke. Nothing grows here now.
This is a street, believe it or not. It was a beautiful place. This is the first time I've been back.
После того, как я сбросил эту бомбу или военный комплект на город, у меня печет в груди, болит в груди. Я страдаю за этих несчастных людей, которые погибли там. Поэтому я и приехал сюда, чтобы помочь отстроить свою страну, поставить опять на ноги ее.
Thankfully, the unthinkable worst-case scenario never comes to pass. As tensions begin to subside, the consequences of the crisis play out very differently for Khrushchev, Castro, and Kennedy. At the Kremlin, the crisis is seen as a critical defeat. The Soviets sting not just from the loss of the strategic advantage in Cuba, but from the perception around the world that they are the losers in the confrontation. Khrushchev personally takes much of the blame. However, in many ways, it is his humanity that is most apparent in the communications between the two superpowers. One wonders whether his anxiety over the possibility of nuclear war affects his ability to negotiate effectively. He would be removed from power less than 2 years later. In Cuba, Castro is furious with Khrushchev for abandoning his country at the climactic moment in its showdown with the United States. Nevertheless, he would retain power for more than 50 years. Cuba continues to be a close ally of Russia, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it remains a staunchly communist nation, just 90 miles from American shores. For President Kennedy, the crisis marks a pivotal moment in his legacy. His handling of the crisis is marked not simply by a willingness to meet aggression with aggression, but rather by his skill in avoiding conflict. His decision to give up U.S. missiles in Turkey, despite the opposition of every single one of his advisors, shows Kennedy's commitment to peace, rather than a belligerent victory. Through his leadership, the danger of mutual annihilation between the two superpowers is narrowly averted.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.